Welcome to Cornerstones of Masonic Contemplation with me, Chuck Dunning. In this video essay, we'll focus on the relevance of contemplative practice to Freemasonry, looking at the most basic ways that Masons should be including this work as part of their progress in seeking the lost word and gaining more light. Despite the focus on the Masonic tradition, just about everything here is applicable to other initiatic traditions like Martinism, Rosicrucianism, Druidry, and so forth. I also want to note that I'll be including some quotes from Masons' personal testimonies about contemplative practice. These are drawn from a survey I did several years ago. So let's begin with this testimony from a Pennsylvania Mason. Quote, "Because of a contemplative approach, my initiation into Freemasonry was a powerful, life-changing experience. The brothers of the lodge and myself all came together on that night with sincerity and open hearts. In the weeks before, they had carefully prepared themselves for their roles. They had also prepared me for mine, advising me to spend time each day in reading, meditation, and prayer. The ritual was beautifully done. The lodge room truly felt like a sanctum, and I experienced the whole thing as an act of brotherly love like nothing I had ever known. Even though the ritual formally ended with the strike of a gavel, in many ways it has never stopped. It set me on a path in which every moment of my life has the potential to reveal more light and for me to share more light with others." End quote. What aspiring new seeker or thoroughly experienced ritualist wouldn't hope for such a meaningful experience of their tradition's initiatic possibilities? In many initiatic societies, contemplative practice in one or more forms is regarded as essential to the deepest experience and understanding of their customs and tenets. Such inner work is also deemed vital to the initiate's self-awareness and to their spiritual, philosophical, and psychological development. Yet in today's most popular initiatic tradition, Freemasonry, a significant percentage of members are nearly, if not totally, in the dark about their tradition's contemplative dimension. Even those who are aware can regard it as a relatively unimportant element that attracts only a small number of their associates. This lack of understanding is why we now examine the value and means of more fully integrating contemplative practice in our Masonic experiences, and especially that of ritual initiation. Note that we are particularly referencing the Preston Webb versions of Masonic ritual and monitorial instructions, though these ideas are certainly not limited to that version of Freemasonry. The meaning of contemplation can vary according to source and context. We're presently using it in its broad sense of representing states or operations of consciousness believed to help one attain greater familiarity with something, including more depth of insight and clarity of understanding. For speculative Masons, Mackey's encyclopedia begins addressing the meaning of contemplative by correctly identifying the word's origin. Quote, "To contemplate is literally to watch and inspect the temple. The augur or prophet among the Romans, having taken his stand on the Capitoline Hill, marked out with his wand the space in the heavens he intended to consult. This space he called the templum, the Latin word for a designated or marked off area. The watching of the templum was called contemplating, and hence those who devoted themselves to meditation upon sacred subjects assumed this title. Among the Freemasons, the word speculative is used as equivalent to contemplative." End quote. In fact, When the English word contemplation first appeared, around 1200 CE, it meant religious musing. In the term musing, we see Mackey's connection with speculation, both words suggesting an attempt to experience a new insight or possibility of meaning. This meaning of contemplation is evident in its use in Masonic ritual. One of the most influential Masonic lecturers of the 18th century, William Preston, references contemplation more than a dozen times in his illustrations of Masonry. Several of those references have become common elements of Masonic ritual and monitorial instructions across many jurisdictions. The following examples are but two, emphasizing the rightful place of contemplation in speculative Masonry. Quote, knowledge is attained by degrees, and cannot everywhere be found. Wisdom seeks the secret shade, the lonely cell designed for contemplation. There enthroned she sits, delivering her sacred oracles. There let us seek her, and pursue the real bliss. End quote. And speaking of speculative Masonry, he says, quote, it leads the contemplative to view with reverence and admiration the glorious works of creation, and inspires them with the most exalted ideas of the perfections of the divine Creator. End quote. Speculative Masonry's own traditional language often asserts contemplation's value for unlocking the fullest experience of the tradition's possibilities. We now turn our attention to exploring how the unlocking can actually be done. It must be acknowledged that every Mason spends some time in contemplation of the tradition's tenets and customs. At the very least, one does so because the ritual itself is designed to focus attention on its symbolic words, actions, and images. In the process, the ritual explains how these things serve as allegories for social and moral development, and it urges participants to continue prayerfully seeking more insight and understanding. Outside of ritual, a Mason naturally slips into contemplation during any pause to think about the meaning of its symbols. Thus, our present concern is not about bringing something entirely new into Masonic experience, but is rather about more intentionally and comprehensively practicing contemplation in order to make the most of Masonic initiations. Contemplative practices include many different ways of opening or focusing awareness, including mindfulness, reflection, dialogue, and study. As we shall see, all four of these practices connect with and support each other, and they are put to good use in conjunction with initiatic experience. A California Mason reports, quote, at one of my favorite lodges, all the brothers line up in silence outside the door before the opening ceremony, and then process into the room in silence. When the master says we are free from restraint, a time when the candidate is being prepared to enter the room to start the ceremony, all the sideliners remain seated in a silent, contemplative state. This is not a passive, uninvolved state, but a deeply engaged one. There is an amazing, powerful atmosphere created by this, a truly sacred space that envelops the candidate from the moment he enters the lodge room. End quote. This quote illustrates the importance of contemplative practice in establishing an optimal atmosphere for Masonic initiations. The most basic of all contemplative practices for anyone in a lodge is simply to be as mentally present as possible with whatever is happening in the moment. This kind of presence, this immediate attentiveness, has become popularized with the term mindfulness. which is the first cornerstone of initiatic contemplative practice. As indicated in the brother's quote, mindfulness is enhanced by the practice of silence, but not a detached silence in which one drifts off along unfocused tangents of thoughts and perceptions. Instead, silence facilitates mindfulness when it is part of minimizing both internal mental distractions and external environmental distractions from the intended activity. Note also that the brother's quote particularly mentions how every member in attendance has a significant role in the practice of mindfulness, not just those performing the ritual. No matter how much the candidate may be contemplatively engaged, the atmosphere of the room and the qualities of the ritual's performance are determined by the ritualists and the audience. Thus, by quietly and consistently redirecting their senses and thoughts to the actions and intentions of the ritual, everyone in attendance directly contributes to its proper performance and the desired effects on the candidate. There are additional applications of mindfulness that are of benefit to ritualists and those who receive or witness their performance. When ritual is mindfully rehearsed, ritualists are more likely to remember or discover the implications of even its most subtle elements, including those in their own speech and actions, as well as the attitudes that naturally accompany them. In that way, they refine their abilities to effectively communicate everything the ritual has to offer the candidate and the audience. Furthermore, while delivering the initiatic experience, ritualists who are mindful of the candidate are more likely to perceive the effects of their performance. Such empathic awareness can prompt ritualists to make helpful adjustments, such as slowing down or changing the loudness of their voices, as well as taking note of particular moments they can revisit with the new initiate after the ritual has ended. Mindfulness can play a similarly significant role with regard to the awareness of and intentional interaction with subtle energies like chi, prana, or those associated with planets and constellations, the Sephirot of Kabbalah, or the classical elements. Of course, mindfulness is also vitally important for candidates to practice during ritual initiation. A Mason from Oklahoma recalls, quote, "A couple of weeks before I received the Master Mason degree, one of my mentors asked what going through the first 2 degrees was like for me. I told him I had missed some things because I was still thinking about the last thing that had happened. I also admitted it was hard not to be wondering about the people and things I couldn't see. So he told me about mindfulness and suggested I immediately start practicing it from time to time during my usual activities. I got a lot more out of the 3rd degree because of that. I was much more aware of details like feelings in the brothers' voices. But since I didn't let myself get lost in those details, didn't try to figure them all out at the time, I was also able to remember the whole thing much more clearly. The practice of mindfulness also stuck with me because of that experience." End quote. This recollection reminds us that while many aspects of ritual serve to draw and keep the candidate's attention, one can easily be overwhelmed by the quantity and unfamiliarity of sensory experiences, ideas, and emotions that arise. A lodge can help with this issue by informing candidates about how common it is and by preparing them to practice mindfulness. Candidates thereby also learn a valuable skill for recognizing and engaging opportunities to apply Masonic teachings in everyday life. Ritual initiation can be understood as a potentially powerful form of experiential learning. The educational theorist David A. Kolb has described such learning as a, quote, process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience, end quote. He suggests all experiential learning includes four elements. First, an actual concrete experience. Second, observing and reflecting on the experience. Third, forming abstract concepts based on reflections. And fourth, testing the new concepts. The delivery of an initiatic ritual provides the element of concrete experience. And in Masonry, it is designed to do so primarily through the senses of hearing, touch, and then sight, each providing its own kinds of information to the candidate. By providing such a rich experience, and especially when the different kinds of sensory input complement each other, initiatic ritual more effectively anchors its information in the mind. The candidate's observation of those sensory inputs, or mindfulness of them, leads into Kolb's second element, which is then more fully engaged by the practice of reflection after the experience. Reflection is thus the second cornerstone of initiatic contemplative practice. Like mindfulness, reflection is enhanced by reducing internal and external distractions. In effect, one establishes a more meditative atmosphere for contemplative reflection, setting aside time and space to engage the process as deeply as possible. At times, contemplative reflection may focus only on a single part of the ritual, while at other times it can be a search for recurring elements, or even an attempt to mentally recreate the entire experience from beginning to end. Such reflections include not only what was perceived through the physical senses, but also one's recollections of the thoughts and emotions that arose along the way. For example, during ritual, participants may mindfully note synchronicities between elements of the ritual and other recent experiences in their lives, and then afterward take time to more thoroughly explore their implications. As with mindfulness, the Lodge can facilitate the process of reflection for its candidates. In fact, some jurisdictions require candidates to learn a catechism, a series of questions and answers about the ritual, which is indeed a formalized reflective process. There are also lodges, and even entire jurisdictions, that require initiates of a degree to submit a reflective essay or a presentation before being allowed to receive another degree. Processes like these not only help solidify a candidate's memories of the initiatic experience, but also provide opportunities to begin forming one's own abstract concepts about it, which is the third element of experiential learning. In Masonry, that element is engaged by speculating on possible meanings of one's experience in addition to those suggested during the ritual and catechism. A Texas Mason reflects, quote, "When I was learning the questions and answers for my EA degree, one of the brothers would sometimes ask questions like, 'What do you remember from that time in the ritual? What were you thinking or feeling then? What do you think that answer means? What might be a completely different way to answer that question? How can you use this in your life?' Questions like those actually became part of Masonry for me, and I've applied them to all the other degrees and installations I've received or performed. By asking those questions of myself and other Masons, I not only learned more about what being a Mason means to me, I have a better understanding of how to perform our rituals than if I had only done the memorization." End quote. In addition to affirming the value of reflection for oneself, this quote also touts its benefits for others. Reflecting on experiences of one's own initiations and upon performances one has either witnessed or given magnifies the technical and empathic benefits previously noted for the practice of mindfulness in rehearsing and delivering ritual. A convenient aid for the reflective process is to remember these three questions: what, so what, and now what. The first question, what, is a prompt to recall the concrete event as clearly as possible, focusing on what physically happened and also the thoughts and feelings that arose as it was happening. Then, so what, the second question, begins exploring what we think the lessons and meanings might be. Finally, the question, now what, is addressed in considering how we might apply those lessons and act on those meanings in the future. When we follow through with such application and action, we have new experiences about which we ask ourselves, what, so what, and now what? In essence, this is a reflective process that supports lifelong learning. To begin examining dialogue as the third cornerstone of initiatic contemplative practice, we observe that 3 of the 4 personal accounts already provided in this article have mentioned influential discussions that occurred either before or after an initiatic experience. Masonic ritual also directly addresses the importance of conversation, as in this statement from the Fellowcraft Degree's instruction on hearing. Quote, by it we are enabled to enjoy the pleasures of society and reciprocally to communicate to each other our thoughts and intentions, our purposes and desires, and thus our reason is rendered capable of exerting its utmost power and energy. The wise and beneficent author of nature intended, by the formation of this sense, that we should be social creatures and receive the greatest and most important part of our knowledge from social intercourse with each other. End quote. Steve Worth, founder and executive director of the Center for Contemplative Dialogue, suggests that as a contemplative practice, dialogue, quote, develops a consistent ability to relate with and to the collective mind of a group, end quote. This understanding of contemplative dialogue offers significant light on Masonry's traditional teaching about the cement of brotherly love, quote, which unites us into one sacred band or society of friends and brothers, among whom no contention should ever exist, but that noble contention, or rather emulation, of who best can work and best agree, end quote. The aim of this practice is not to develop a strict conformity or submission to prevailing ideas and attitudes. Rather, because contemplative dialogue includes deep and compassionate listening, it lovingly encourages and nurtures the freedom of participants to authentically express themselves without fear of hostility or derision. Likewise, while contemplative dialogue can include the testing element of experiential learning, it is not about contesting and defending ideas and attitudes in an effort to prove that someone is totally right while someone else is absolutely wrong. It is instead a conversation with a center, not sides, driven by the intention of members to explore things together, each agreeing to open oneself to possibilities that are not limited by personal habits in perceiving, making assumptions, or making judgments. With regard to initiatic experience, in some traditions, such dialogue may also occur during the initiation ritual. But in speculative Masonry, that is typically not the case. Even so, There's much to be gained in the practice of contemplative dialogue before and after a Masonic initiation ritual, and by candidates, ritualists, and audience members alike. For example, prior to the event, candidates and members of the lodge can come together in dialogue about the candidate's motives, intentions, and desired outcomes. Doing so may help candidates attain greater self-awareness and understanding of what they are seeking, why they are seeking it, and what they are willing to give to that quest. In exchange, lodge members may reflect upon their own initiatic experiences in ways that help candidates determine if they are on a suitable path or suggest possibilities they had not previously considered about themselves, their quest, or its effects on their lives. Soon after an initiation ritual, a new initiate's practice of reflection can be powerfully facilitated by members engaging the initiate in dialogue about the initiatic experience. Much as with dialogue before the event, new initiates benefit not only from sharing their own reflections and the meanings they find in them, but also from listening to more seasoned members do so. Fortunately, the benefits of contemplative dialogue are not limited to candidates, for even the most experienced members may come to see their initiatic work through new eyes and hear its words through new ears. Consider this testimony from another Mason in Oklahoma. Quote, "In my Masonic experience, one thing that has been very helpful to me is sitting down with a brother or group of brothers to have really good open discussions. That often happens after lodge in some quiet place where we won't be bothered. It also happens in our Scottish Rite reunions after a group meditation or during an education session. What's amazing is how guys just start sharing their thoughts about a symbol, and some of us have been students of Freemasonry for most of our lives, but the next thing you know, we're all coming to a new insight together. It's a synergistic thing that not only makes my Masonic experience richer, but lots of things that have come out of those discussions are still with me when I do ritual work, sometimes right there in my mind while I'm speaking lines related to them. I know that makes me a better ritualist and instructor." For an earnest recommendation of study as the fourth cornerstone of initiatic contemplative practice, we again turn to Preston. Quote, "Masonry is an art useful and extensive. In every art there is a mystery, which requires a progress of study and application to arrive at any degree of perfection. Without much instruction and more exercise, no man can be skillful at any art. In like manner, without an assiduous application to the curious subjects treated in the different lectures of Masonry, no person can be sufficiently acquainted with its true value." End quote. Reading may well be the most common activity that comes to mind when people speak of study. For centuries, reading has served as the linchpin of most disciplines in both public and private educational institutions. Reading is also a key element in the professional, philosophical, psychological, spiritual, or religious development of many people. It is therefore not surprising to find an abundant body of literature specifically related to Masonry, and many jurisdictions providing candidates and new initiates with specific texts for study. In some cases, the reading of those texts is mandatory. There is also a virtually limitless expanse of non-Masonic works about curious subjects that intersect with Masonic studies. While there are many sources providing recommendations about which works to read, we now give our consideration to how contemplative reading is done and how it can enhance an initiatic experience. Before proceeding, we note that while reading serves as our primary example for contemplative study, many of its principles and processes are applicable to other kinds of study, such as oral instruction, listening to video essays, meditation upon a symbolic image, or examining one's own dreams. Contemplative reading benefits greatly from conditions conducive to the previous cornerstones. As with mindfulness and ritual, the best environment for contemplative reading is relatively free from distraction, enabling one to attend as fully as possible to the text at hand, as well as one's own thoughts and feelings. One slows down in order to check any tendencies, like making assumptions about the meanings of words, focusing on only one particular meaning among other possibilities, brushing past words or phrases that aren't immediately understood, or mentally leaping forward in anticipation of where the text may lead. A slower, more careful consideration naturally leaves time and mental space for the process of reflection. One pauses to review what has just been read, not only to more fully reflect upon it in isolation, but also to more completely grasp its place in the context of what came before it. This kind of presence with the text and oneself becomes a sort of dialogue. There is a recurring inquisitiveness about meaning and direction, almost as if one is repeatedly asking the author of the text for elaboration, and a conversation with oneself in speculation about possibilities of meaning. One might even bring others into this solitary dialogue by consulting a dictionary, thesaurus, encyclopedia, or other texts in order to gain either greater precision or a broader scope in the development of one's understanding. These processes can reveal implications of the text that the author may or may not have elucidated or even considered. Such an approach also encourages critical thinking, increasing the likelihood that one will notice the strengths and weaknesses of logic and rhetoric in the text, as well as in one's own interpretation. Furthermore, contemplative reading does not limit itself to strictly rational processes like analysis, comparing and contrasting, and forming association. One may also patiently and prayerfully hold a word, phrase, or sentence at the center of a relatively quiet and clear mental space, allowing for the possibility of intuition or inspiration, perhaps even revelation, to enter that space from outside one's immediate awareness and stimulate the imagination. Affirming the value of contemplative study, a Mason from British Columbia writes, quote, "Before I was initiated, a friend and brother provided a few preparatory things to read. Among the terms that most captured my attention were mystic tie and Masonic light. Already into meditation before becoming a Mason, I took first one and then the other into a series of meditations over several days, and also did a bit more reading. The practice was productive, giving me a richer backdrop for the initiatic experience. What I didn't yet know was how the work would pay off. Upon ceremonially being brought to light, there was a sudden coalescence of meaning in which I experienced Masonic light as the mysterious energy that is already the essence of our spiritual connection or mystic tie with deity and each other. It dawned upon me that we, sons of light, have committed ourselves, each in our own way, to seeking greater awareness of this truth and to laboring for its greater realization in this world. That epiphany still informs everything I do as a Mason, and most assuredly my presence in the initiation, passing, and raising of others." End quote. We have seen that the previous contemplative practices have a number of applications before and after initiatic experiences, and the same is true of contemplative study. This quote provides an example of how contemplative study has proven valuable to a candidate, who now brings that value into the ritual work he performs for others. Sometimes studies like this are prescribed for candidates and new initiates as the standing policy of a lodge or larger jurisdiction. In any case, Masonic and related studies can be recommended and encouraged, with the fruits of those studies welcomed into fraternal communication where members can make them the subject of their own studies, take them into their own reflections, and join together in dialogue about them. Indeed, the Master Mason's lesson on the beehive teaches that Masons should, quote, "be endeavoring to aid to the common stock of knowledge and understanding," end quote. Making use of the symbolic language of speculative Masonry, we note that each of these four cornerstones, mindfulness, reflection, dialogue, and study, is the product of careful labor. Part of that labor is their perfecting, which is to say that each should be refined in order to make it both more beautiful and more effective, and thus more suitable for its place in the contemplative foundation of an individual or a body of Masons. Another aspect of the work is setting the cornerstones and doing so in a way that each is stable and properly oriented so that it complements the others and contributes to their collective strength. In operative Masonry, there is a point at which the perfecting and setting of cornerstones is complete. However, in speculative Masonry, the work is ever evolving because these cornerstones are practices that not only establish and maintain, but also improve the wisdom, strength, and beauty of a Masonic edifice. We should also consider that in speculative Masonry, just as with operative Masonry, the execution of any such work requires tools, techniques, training, and motive. As these four cornerstones of initiatic contemplative practice depend in one way or another upon the proper application of the mind, we can discern that the primary working tool is consciousness itself. However, as known by anyone who has ever attempted any sort of craft work, it is not enough to possess the necessary tool. One must also understand and be skilled in the techniques by which it is employed. Although everyone constantly uses the mind in ways that are both instinctive and learned, many people are not well versed or experienced in the techniques of contemplative consciousness. In our previous considerations, we have seen that the tool of consciousness is used in many ways for many purposes. Yet there is a very apt analogy with the Mason's compass that reveals a manner of working with consciousness inherent to all others. Like the compass, consciousness may be closed down to a very narrow radius, producing a circle so tight as to be nearly indistinguishable from its focal point. On the other hand, it can be opened to its utmost limit. Facility with the technique of mental focus, like any other skill, requires training and practice. There are numerous methods of meditation that can be helpful in developing the ability to willingly tune one's focus between the extremes. Even so, there is none more fundamental or ubiquitous than silently sitting for the careful and sustained observation of one's own mind. Within this practice, one can experience how attention may focus on the smallest detail of the mind's contents, expand to trace the paths of ideas or the emergence of images, or open to sense the immeasurable expanse of consciousness, extending into mystical possibilities beyond our ability to fully comprehend. One begins to experiment and gradually becomes more adept at finding and holding a focus and scope of attention better suited to one's purposes. As with any other form of work, energy is required for the inner work of training and employing one's consciousness. Furthermore, the energy involved in work is not limited to the force applied in actually executing a task, such as the swing of a gavel. Energy must first manifest in the internal drive to pick up the gavel and swing it with both power and precision. In other words, the force that executes any kind of intentional work is first stirred by the energy of one or more motives. We therefore do well to consider the motives that impel the initiatic work of speculative Masons. Masons have many different personal answers about why they sought initiation. The range of those answers includes desiring self-improvement, belonging to a great institution, respecting tradition, bonding with individuals for whom they have admiration and affection, seeking wisdom, devotion to truth, service to others, and so on. In reflecting on these motives and intentions, it is noteworthy that all the functional terms, desiring, belonging, respecting, bonding, admiring, affection, seeking, devotion, service, are all also used when we try to explain the nature of love. It is therefore presently suggested that the primary force moving anyone into speculative Masonry may be understood in terms of love manifesting in one or more forms. Love is therefore also presently offered as the primary motive and guiding force for initiatic contemplative practice. To be open to this possibility, to deeply investigate it within oneself and one's associates, and to embrace and nurture whatever truth may be found in doing so, is to recognize and more directly tap into the channels of power that transform ceremonies of membership into genuine initiatic experiences. Thank you for joining me in considering these cornerstones of Masonic contemplation. If you're interested in learning more, then in addition to my books, I recommend these websites. The Masonic Legacy Society freely offers resources on integrating contemplative practice with Masonic education. The College of the Consistory preserves the educational materials of the Academy of Reflection, which provide written instruction in a broad range of contemplative practices. It is also possible to connect with contemplative mentors through their website. Once again, thanks for joining me. I wish you more wisdom, strength, and beauty.